This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Hello and welcome back to Beyond the Big Screen. I'm your host, Mustache Chris, and today I'm joined by my partner, Frank. We got to get you a nickname, Frank. We got to figure out a nickname.
Got to earn a nickname, man.
On today's episode, we're going to be tackling the classic film Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs came out in 1991, and it's based on the Thomas Harris novel of the same name that came out in 1988. The film was directed by Jonathan Demme and written by Ted Talley. The film was distributed by Orion Pictures, which unfortunately isn't around anymore. It could be around in some capacity because it was a really interesting studio that let directors have a lot of leeway. It was very director friendly. A lot of films I don't think people would a lot of really, really good films was released by Orion. And I believe they actually got into video games at one point. Unfortunately, it's like I said, it's not around anymore. But pretty much every major studio. It seems like Disney's the only one that's left around now.
Paramount, 20th Century, they're still there. MGM, right? It's funny, when I was young, watching movies as a young man, when that studio graphic would come up, I always equated that with either a good movie or not. And Orion was one that I always was like, oh, it's an Orion movie, it's going to be a good one. They had a really good reputation there in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, Silence of the Lambs is generally considered one of the greatest and most influential films of all time. I would probably put it top 15 on my list. I don't know. What's your opinion, Frank? Where does that Silence of the Lambs rank in the history of, let's just say, American cinema?
So to use your wrestling, I know you love wrestling, so I'll use a wrestling analogy here. I think I'm going to be the heel in this episode to a degree, because I think this is a good film. I think it's a great film. It's probably in my top 50 or 100. I mean, it's nowhere near the top 10 or even top 20. And it's not necessarily because there's anything wrong with it. There's some really great things that we're going to talk about. It's just there are other movies that I like better. So it's not a detraction from Silence of the Lambs, but I am an outlier on that. But you are absolutely correct in that many people view it as one of the best crime films of all time, and then just one of the best films, period. And a lot of that, I think, comes down to a piece we're going to dive into in some depth, I know, and that is the acting of Jodie Foster and especially how Anthony Hopkins portrays Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah, I'm not quite I'm kind of like you. I'd put in maybe top 50. I don't know. I go back and forth with it because there's some parts of it I really like. I like that it straddles the line between this is kind of like a police procedural and a horror film.
Yeah,
that's the big debate. Has always been about Silence of the Lambs. Is it a horror film? And I go, it's definitely shot like a horror film.
Oh, yeah.
In terms of the lighting and everything like that. The influence of Twin Peaks is very heavy on Silence of the Lambs. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So I guess we'll go give a quick plot run through, and then we'll
for the five people who've never seen the movie.
You wouldn't believe it. I was at work, and there's a lot of younger people at work, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm doing something on Silence of the Lambs, and they're 20, so it's somewhat understandable, but they're like, I've never seen it. I'm like, how have you, your parents never watched it with you when you got older or something? Or
that's the thing is that even though my ranking on this, and who am I? I'm just a guy, right? So what does my list matter? But even though my ranking of it is lower maybe than a lot of mainstream critics who do this for a living, I recognize that it's a very well written, very well directed, very well shot, very well acted. the sets are believable and excellent. I mean, it's a really good movie, very well done. And it is a movie that, if I was making a list of movies that people should see, that see these 100 movies before you die kind of lists that are out there, this would absolutely be, slam dunk, quick one to put on that list, for all of those reasons. So you get on those 20 somethings at work, man. They need to get their education rolling.
Oh, it's weird. Then they'll just like, oh, I refute. Like, I don't know. I find like a lot of young kids. It could be because of just because they grew up on phones and stuff like that. They don't seem to have they just don't watch film. So it's all like TikToks and like shorts, and they don't seem to have I don't know, the attention span to like sit through like a 2-hour movie, which is.
And this is a 2-hour movie. You nailed it. I mean, most movies are an hour 40-ish, and this is a little longer, so it does take a little more attention. The other thing I noticed, Chris, that because I just watched this again for our discussion after quite a few years, and the opening titles look they're very dated, and even for the 90s, even for when it came out. And so I wonder if that would put some younger viewers off. Like, they start watching it and they're like, oh, this is hokey. Look at these credits and some girl running in the woods. I'm out. I'm going to go watch TikTok.
It's possible. I noticed that too, where I felt like I saw the titles and I'm like, almost kind of just seems like a pilot for a TV show. Like the title ones. Yeah. I don't know. I never, when in my research, I never got into it. Like, were they thinking about maybe turning this into a TV show or something like that? Like, this was filmed as a film, so this wasn't like a pilot episode for a TV show that just didn't take off. And they're like, well, we have this great footage here. Let's try to turn it into a movie. That never happened. But it does. The title sequence does feel like something off a TV show.
And the sets look wonderful. The sets look like a feature film. They're all very believable, from the conversations between the two principal characters at the mental institution to, when she's running in the woods, but and everything in between. But those credits, they didn't do themselves any favors there.
Honestly, one of the more interesting themes in the book and the movie is childhood trauma and how it affects people differently, and depending on the amount of trauma that one goes through in their life. There's a good contrast between, say, Bill and Starling herself, and how they both dealt with trauma and decided to direct it in pretty much the opposite ends of the spectrum. Whereas in the movie, we don't get into it as much, but in the book, they get into more detail. But Lecter has one line that basically says that Bill he didn't just become the way he became. Like, he was created by society to become what he is now, right? And in the book, I guess we'll get into the book a little bit. Like, in the book, we find out that his mom was like an alcoholic, failed actress that beat him. And then he stayed in and out of foster homes, which I can only assume, people beat him. His dad wasn't around. And then he ended up staying with his grandparents, which is weird because you would figure, the mother's an alcoholic. That would be the first person they would go to, is like the immediate family. So obviously they didn't want anything to do with him either. And this was just like the last choice by the state's like, well, we tried different foster homes. None of this has worked out. Like, you guys have no choice. So you have to take care of them. And
what a rejection to have. I mean, he's 10 years old, 12 years old. That's got to sting.
and then the book, we find out that he just obviously didn't like his grandparents very much, because he just killed them, because why not? That's how beaten and abused he was at that point. And that's a reference to, there's a serial killer that did the same thing too. I believe Ed Kemper. Yeah. So obviously he takes this childhood trauma, and he decides, like, you know what? The world screwed me over so much and has been so mean and so cruel to me. I'm going to inflict it on the world itself in the way that I can, right? And because of all the trauma that he had gone through in his life, it's somewhat understandable that he would be going through an identity crisis, right? Which is a huge theme of the book too, in terms of the psychology of Buffalo Bill. He doesn't know exactly who he is. why would he? He's never fit in anywhere. No one's ever wanted anything to do with him. And it just goes about to show you that I wouldn't necessarily say just because, like, say you were like abused or people go through extreme trauma that you're going to become somebody like Buffalo Bill, because we're going to get into a character, maybe not as extreme, but she went through a fair amount of trauma herself. But it definitely doesn't help if you're kind of genetically predisposed to this type of behavior, which is, I know that's the kind of a controversial subject in terms of the psychotic gene, the antisocial gene. But this, getting treated like this definitely doesn't help in terms of triggering that gene to become active. I don't know. What do you think, Frank?
Well, it's the old, nature versus nurture argument. Is somebody genetically predisposed to being a certain way, or does their environment shape them? And, I don't think it's an either or situation. I think most people probably fall in that category of thought. And I was, as some listeners may remember, I was a police officer for 20 years. And, we had families in the city where I worked that had, a family full of criminals, right? But they were all, if it was a decent sized family, if there's like 3 kids, there's always one who wasn't, and who was like, didn't like being associated with their family, and, was working a job and trying to do, live a good life and everything. And the other siblings were, stealing and doing drugs and fighting and doing, whatever, all this criminal stuff. And so, how do you account for, if you believe it's all environment, how do you account for that when, 4 people grew up in the same environment and 3 of them became criminals and 1 didn't? Is it, because of that one person's genetic makeup, their personality, that they responded differently to that roughly the same stimulus of living in that home? I mean, there's all other kinds of other things that would come into play. Obviously, did the parents treat the kids different? And, there's a ton of variables, but, I don't know enough about genetics, and I don't know enough about psychology to say which way it was for this character. I think the one thing I will say, though, is I do think it would be, it was universally or nearly universally hailed as a great movie when it came out. I mean, you probably have the awards they won on, right there on the tip of your tongue. I don't remember what they were. I think Demi won for director, maybe. Do you remember what the awards were for this?
They won Best Picture, I believe. I don't know if Demi won Best Director. I know it won Best Picture. I always found that was so odd that you can win Best Picture but not Best Director. And I'm like, well, who's the number one factor in creating a film? It's the director, is it not? I don't know. And then Jodie Foster won an Oscar. She won a previous Oscar too, and trying to remember what it was called.
Taxi Driver, wasn't it, when she won as a young girl?
No, she won another one. It was like around this time period too. Anthony Hopkins won an Oscar, obviously. So I believe it won like 3 Oscars.
So here we have a movie that that was just showered with golden statues. And if it were made today, though, exactly the same movie, shot for shot, line for line, with better opening credits. I think there'd be some pushback from people because of the trans nature of Buffalo Bill's situation, and whether he was, truly trans or not. And which of course Lecter says he's not. He's just, as you alluded to, he's a lost soul when it comes to his own identity. So he's casting around for different things, and this is what he lands on. And so, that kind of gets you out of the woods when it comes to demonizing, transsexual people. But I don't think it would be taken that way. I think it would still be looked at today, and maybe even looking back at it, people would say that it was, kind of an anti-trans stance, and that's, that would be troubling for a lot of viewers, and so it's just something that occurred to me as I was watching it. I mean, it's no deep thought necessarily. It's a pretty obvious one when you think about it. But That's just, and I guess my whole point in saying this is I don't know enough about about psychology in general, genetics in general, and certainly, I'm not qualified to break down this fictional character's, psychosis and what's going on. I do think that the character of Lecter is pretty smart, and he never lied to Starling that I recall. He withheld information, but he never lied to her. And his diagnosis was that the guy, wasn't transsexual. He was just a messed up guy who hooked into that as almost a rescue identity for him, if that makes sense.
Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Richard Lim's This American President and other great shows. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more, and here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, I tend to, on previous podcasts, I believe we've talked, I've talked about this before. I tend to lean a little bit more on the genetic side of things. And that's a very, I'm not an expert, obviously. I've read a fair amount about it, but that's typically pretty controversial take, because a lot of people don't like the idea that people are just born a certain way, and it's very difficult for them to change, regardless of their situation. But I will say that certain environmental factors can trigger certain genetic dispositions, right? Like what I touched on it earlier, right? Maybe Buffalo Bill, if he's raised in a loving household, he might be genetically disposed to this type of antisocial behavior, but maybe it doesn't get triggered, because his parents are loving. He actually has friends and family. But because he grew up in a situation where everybody was just abusing him constantly, this identity crisis that I believe was baked in him right from the get-go came out in this violent fashion. Whereas for a lot of people, most people, they go through identity crises all the time. It's just part of being human. We don't know exactly what we are, the person that we want to be. We're able to just kind of navigate through it by, talking to friends, talking to your parents. If you look at a teenager, and I think a lot of older people really forget how hard it is to be a teenager. That whole process is you just trying to figure out the type of person that you want to be. That's why kids go nuts about what type of clothes am I going to wear? What type of music am I going to wear? How am I going to wear my makeup? Because they're trying to find out exactly who they are. And whereas older people will be like, oh, this is all stupid. I'm like, no, this is extremely stressful on a young person. But that's somewhat of a tangent. But yeah, I tend to lean a little bit more towards the genetic side of things, and a lot of people don't like that. And I've gone into many arguments online and in person about the importance of genetics. But I always say with that environmental factors can either trigger them or not trigger them. And
yeah, there's no question that environment matters. And I think that Thomas Harris, the author, would definitely agree that the environment matters. If you look at Buffalo Bill, if you look at Francis Dollarhide and Red Dragon, I mean, these antagonists, these serial killers that he creates, their environments were horrible. So, I guess you could, to kind of put a point on this conversation so we can move on, I would say you could equate it to playing some poker, right? Like you can't affect the cards that you're dealt. That's genetics, right? You got, if all you have is a Jack 2, that's what you were dealt. But how you play those cards and how the game evolves, that's the environment. And can you still win the pot with a Jack 2? Depends on what cards get flipped up in the flop and turn in the river. And it depends on how you play the game, but, you're still playing with a Jack and a 2. Yeah, the other thing I wanted to point out is nothing to do with the psychology of it. It's just that Harris, in both of these books, these terrible, terrible serial killers, get stupid names for stupid reasons. I mean, the Buffalo Bill is a stupid name for a serial killer compared to, I mean, I understand why they give it to him and everything, but it's just somebody made a smart ass comment. In both cases, I think it was an offhand smart ass comment that some cop made, and then it got loose. And, the same thing with the Tooth Fairy, because he bit the victims and had an odd dental situation going on. They call him the Tooth Fairy, and nothing could be more ridiculous for what Francis Dollarhide was trying to do. Well, I mean, calling Jamie Gum Buffalo Bill is just as silly, in my opinion. But they're both of these characters are all about transformation. I mean, Francis Dollarhide is trying to become the Red Dragon. Buffalo Bill is, obsessed with these moths and butterflies or whatever that are transforming, coming out of the chrysalis and becoming something different. And that's what he thinks he's trying to accomplish in this completely grisly fashion. So there's some consistency there in Thomas Harris's work with his antagonists.
Well, and then in terms of like the kind of segue to another part of the childhood trauma is Starling dealt with childhood trauma her entire life too. I will say though that in her case, so her dad died when she was quite young, but she had a positive, loving relationship with her dad, right? She idolized her dad up until the point that this is the whole reason that she ends up becoming, or at least at this point, I guess, is trying to become an FBI agent because she's trying to live in her dad's footsteps, right? She ends up going to live with her, was it her grandparents that she lived with for a bit?
I thought it was an aunt or an uncle.
Oh yeah, she ended up, it was an aunt and her uncle for a bit who, like, he runs a farm or what have you, and she has this traumatic event where she's trying to save these lambs she hears them screaming, so she tries to save one, which is kind of indicative of just as her entire character, right? And being a police officer in general, and you can hear all this screaming, and obviously for the majority of people, they're absolutely horrified by it, but you're not going to save all those people, but maybe you can save the one lamb, right? And the one lamb's obviously representative of a person, right? That's the symbolism of that story, right? So Starling is trying to emulate her dad that she obviously loved, but she also lost at a very young age, and she's always trying to save that one screaming lamb. Whereas she took the trauma that happened in her life and tried to direct it towards like a positive in society. I can speak candidly, like personally myself, or, I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of my crazy life. I've had a really crazy life that sometimes I'll tell people and they're like, oh my God, like, I don't understand how you turned out the way you did, like you don't drink, you don't do drugs, you don't do, you know what I mean? Like you don't, you're a happy guy, you're intelligent, you're, dedicated to whatever you're doing, you have a family. But like I lost my mom when I was quite young, 10, 11, and then I lost my dad a couple of years later. So for a big chunk of my life, I've been an orphan, right? And like my whole family kind of fell apart too when that happened. And, I very easily could have gone down a different road, and I think it would have been somewhat understandable, but I chose not to, right? I said, I wanted to, the way I looked at it was maybe I could be an example for other people. It's like, you can go through a lot of horrible things in your life, but you can choose to not let it completely ruin your life and ruin the people around you, right? Because that's the whole thing about going down that type of road. It's like, not only are you destroying yourself, but more importantly, the people around you, you'll end up dragging them into your, to put it bluntly, BS too, right? And I decided pretty early on that I would view myself as kind of as an example for other people. It's like, as bad as your life is, you don't necessarily have to go down a bad road. And here, I'm an example. And I've always been very helpful in terms of wanting to talk to people. It's like, hey, you're going through a hard time and you can talk to me, man. Just, I know about hard times. I know what it's like to be down in the dumps. And I believe I've helped some people. I think I've had people come up to me and they say they look up to me because of some of the stuff that's gone in my life. It's not like I go around talking about it to a lot of people in terms of details and all that. The couple people I find as I get older, it's more younger people. Older people I tend to not care as much about because, you know what, you've already made your decisions and you're not going to listen. But somebody like 19, 20, I think I feel like I can still maybe somewhat make a difference in their life by just listening to them talk. You know, you believe it or not, people think it's crazy, but just listening to someone talk and not just waiting for your turn to talk is extremely helpful to people.
Well, I mean, kudos to you for both being a mentor and choosing to get through hard times in a way that's positive. And I'm glad you had that choice. I think there's some psychology there that you saw it as a choice. You know, maybe Buffalo Bill, again, we're talking about a fictional character here, but still, you know, he may not have felt he had that choice. I don't know, but I do know that, like, Clarice's psychology, it just strikes me that, you know, it makes sense that she would turn it into something positive because the relationship itself was positive. The tragedy wasn't, you know, her dad died and she was young and she idolized him, like you said, but the relationship was positive. And so it makes sense to me that the character would try to channel that grief into ultimately a positive thing. And so it follows. It's good. It's a neat parallel between the two, and a contrast between the two, as you point out.
Well, it's also kind of points to whereas you could argue that a bit of trauma in your life is actually a good thing, and it can be a motivating factor in terms of wanting to do better or make a difference in the world. Whereas if there's too much trauma, there's too much abuse, it just breaks somebody, you know?
Yeah. It's like rain, right? I mean, rain is going to fall and rain, and it's actually a good thing that it does. Too much rain and it's a flood, you know, and that has a negative effect. So, I think you're right. I mean, we don't live in a utopia where trauma doesn't happen, but let's be honest, losing your parents at a young age is on the, you know, further end of the spectrum when it comes to trauma. And certainly what Buffalo Bill went through is even, you know, further. I should call him Jamie Gum because that's a better way to look at him. But, you know, what he went through as a child is even further down that road, similar to what Francis Dollarhide had dealt with in Red Dragon. But yeah, trauma, you know, I mean, I think you pointing out childhood trauma as one of the themes of this movie is absolutely bang on. It's very blatantly there and used as an excellent explanation for why these two different characters who had some vaguely similar experiences as children have gone the directions they've gone.
I guess now we can move on to the other major theme that we decided on, which is it's probably going to be a little bit awkward, but it's the combination of sex and violence, which is, you can't talk about this film without talking about that, right? Because it's such a huge part of Starling's and Lecter's relationship, and Crawford too, right? Yeah, so I guess one of the more interesting aspects of the book and the film is the fact that Hannibal Lecter finds Starling attractive, which is, it's as gross as it sounds. It's there, right? And I would argue to a certain degree, she finds him a wee bit attractive too, right? Because she definitely has a type, which is older men. And that could be from the fact that her father died when she was quite young, and she's almost searching for like a father type figure. Immediately, like right off the bat, like when they have their first interaction and Starling goes and talks to Hannibal Lecter, you could tell that Lecter is immediately interested. They drop a line where Lecter hadn't seen a woman in 8 years. I think it's something, was it 8 years or something? He's never seen a female. And you could tell like immediately he's kind of, oh my God, she's good looking, right? And, you know, he starts talking to her right away. And then we also find out that he had never really done this with anybody else, right? So obviously he's, you know, he's a little smitten. He's got a bit of a crush. And then, you know, like they have their first meeting, and the, you know, Miggs, which is Hector's cellmate, who's it is so disgusting, but there's a part of the character that's actually kind of funny. Just the way Lecter is with Miggs. Lecter feels bad of what happens immediately, and he's just like, no, come back, I'll give you some information, which he would never have done with anybody else. And I don't know, what do you feel? Like, to me, it's like, this is like probably the grossest part of the film when we're talking about a guy that skins dead bodies, is the fact that like there's like this undercurrent sexual relationship between Starling and Hannibal.
Well, I'm going to steal a line, I guess, from Jodie Foster regarding how Lecter would not do certain things because he would find them rude. I think what Miggs did was very rude. But there's way grosser things that happen in the movie to my take of it. However, like, I wonder, I haven't read the book in a long time. I didn't reread the book for this. I just watched the movie. And so if you've read the book more recently, you can speak to this. But I'm wondering how much of what you just said about the relationship between the two, Starling and Lecter, is colored by what happened in the book versus what's on the screen. Because on the screen, when I watched it, and it was like 2 days ago, I saw attraction. I saw like a light physical attraction, maybe, and probably one-sided, more on Lecter's part. But the majority of the attraction that I saw between the two was more intellectual, and definitely on Starling's part. I think you're onto something with the father figure thing, although I think it's you know, more Jack Crawford who's filling that position than Lecter, but there's some crossover there. There's definitely sexual tension there, but it feels like it's more fueled by intellectual than just straight up physical. I mean, certainly on you know, Jodie. It's interesting. Jodie Foster is a pretty woman in this movie, and she's at a very pretty age. You know, she's in her 30s, I think, at the time, and so she's attractive. And we're going to talk about it a little later, I think. But I mean, they really reinforce that by having a lot of people check her out. You know, I mean, throughout the movie, but she isn't, you know, knocked down, you know, traffic stopping gorgeous. You know, she's not, you know, one of the Hemsworth brothers level of, you know, of physical beauty that, you know, people are going to stop for. Trying to think of who the Cindy Crawford of today is, but you get what I'm saying. She has kind of a girl next door, you know, studious professional sort of attractiveness, which is exactly what one would think Lecter would find attractive. So it makes sense. But I almost felt, you know, although I don't disagree with you on the sexual tension piece, I really felt there was more, the more likely relationship to develop between the two of them if they were unhindered by a variety of factors, such as him being insane and being in a cell and so forth. I think it would have been more of a friendship that developed eventually, as opposed to something romantic. I don't remember, but I think it was spelled out a little differently in the books, but I'm just talking about what I saw on the screen. Now, you read the books more recently, I think. Is that a little different?
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
They get into it a little bit more in terms of kind of this like sexual tension between the two of them. And I said, in the film, you see it where, you know, Starling comes back and she grabs the case file that the Hannibal Lecter read over, what have you. And Lecter just like kind of touches her finger quickly. And it's like time he's touched a woman in probably 8 years, right? Well, however long he's been in jail for, which I'm drawing a blank right now. He's been in there for quite some time. But I think you're onto something in terms of like, say, yeah, like him not being insane. And they were just, you know, like I don't know, maybe Lecter was just like a psychologist that helped the FBI on. Maybe they would have developed a like a friendship that if the age gap wasn't as large, maybe it might have turned into something more than that. That's how I feel. It's, I don't know, it's one of the, I don't know, it's one of the part of the films that kind of makes me a little bit like just icky.
The other interesting piece on this whole sex and violence sort of aspect to this, the movie's themes, is that a lot of serial killing is sexual violence. I mean, not all of it, but a lot of it. It happens. It's not infrequent. And that's what people usually go to first too, when they're thinking about a serial killer. Like that there's some sexual component there. And I guess in a way there really isn't in this movie, even though we would, they're finding these bodies nude and so forth, but there's no sexual assault that takes place. And so it's interesting that, usually there is, but there isn't here. But instead we get this sort of odd sexual tension between Clarice and Lecter to a small degree in the film, to a greater degree in the book. There's the same kind of thing happening with Crawford in the book. I remember it being far more pronounced. I remember feeling like Crawford was, maybe overstepping as a leader for sure. And while I don't think Clarice Starling was a starry-eyed, co-ed that some horny professor was taking advantage of type of situation, she still could, there's an imbalance of power there. And there's an experience difference, and life experience difference, and so forth. So if he was crushing on her, and if he was thinking about her in those ways and holding out for a possibility there, that was certainly wrong. I don't think anybody would disagree, or most people would anyway. And so there's this, that's where the sexual tension was, as opposed to, something gross happening in the killings. We did a show on Manhunter, and it's related because the character of Lecter, the same author, wrote the books, the Red Dragon and Silence of the Lambs, and they don't really get into it in the movie, but in the book, there's, that it is a sexual homicide, that Francis Dollarhide commits, and Jamie Gum here in Silence of the Lambs that isn't. But anyway, I just think it's interesting that all this sexual tension comes from the investigative side of things rather than the criminal side of things.
Yeah, that is interesting. Actually, I never really noticed that before, but that's a good observation.
Well, and it segues pretty easily into the other thing we were going to talk about, and that is how Clarice Starling is very clearly a female in a male-dominated world or profession anyway. And boy, do they hammer that home. I mean, it's almost ham-handed when I watched it again. I felt like it was overdone, to be honest with you. Not that the point wasn't valid and that it wasn't something worth exploring, but it was one of the few things I don't think was handled very gracefully. I think it was handled pretty, was handled with a sledgehammer rather than, than a little more delicately.
Well, yeah, as you pointed out, like the next thing we're going to talk about is Starling in a male-dominated world. I mean, we're almost immediately right off the bat, right? We see Starling is getting checked out by literally every male police officer at the training facility at Quantico. Like as soon as she walks in, like literally every single guy's head is turning.
Yeah, and it's just ridiculous because I mean, maybe it wasn't in the 90s. I don't remember. But I don't remember it being like that. I mean, it's almost like you're at, they're acting, they have these guys acting like they're at the gym and, and some, one of these knockouts that you were talking about before walked in and, very skimpy clothing, and is prancing around. And so they're looking at her. I mean, it's just overdone, I think, to make the point. And I get it. In movies, that's what you have to do. You have to make the point very loudly and quickly and then move on because you don't have the same kind of time as you do in a novel to explore it. But I just thought it was overdone. The shot of her going into the elevator and being so much smaller than everybody in the elevator, I think that was a little overdone too, but I think that was a little bit, I won't say more subtle because it's not a very subtle shot, but it's not as ham-handed, I don't think, as having everybody go, ooh, la, la, every time she walks by. While I love the concept that they're exploring here, and I think it's very valid and needs to be and is interesting. The way it was done, I think Demi was a little clumsy with it. You made a point when we were talking before that, in mentioning kind of the tension between her and Jack Crawford, and my sense of it was that it was explored much more deeply in the book, but maybe you can speak to that. But it's obvious that he has that towards her, but you feel like she's attracted to Crawford too. Am I right? Is that
Oh
your
yeah,
take?
for sure.
I didn't see that. I didn't really see that as much on the screen. I know it's there in the book, and it makes sense. I mean, he's a lot like her dad, you know.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, and so it makes sense that there may be elements of his personality that she finds attractive.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I guess that's the like kind of segue past the more ham-fisted parts of it in this one. The relationship between Starling and Crawford, I find, it's much more the way they do it in the film. It's not as ham-fisted. It's a little bit more nuanced. Like we know, you can tell immediately that Crawford finds Starling attractive, and not just physically, like in terms of her ability to like overcome problems and intellectually. He respects her, but he also is very attracted to her. And I think Starling, me personally, the vibe I got off was that she finds him equally attractive too. But she can't, like, they really can't go through with it because for lots of reasons. I mean, Crawford's her boss. It would be inappropriate. Starling's already having a difficult enough time being, it's just for arguments like she's the only woman in Quantico, like getting training in the FBI.
Oh, that's not accurate though. I mean, she's got a girlfriend that's
that's
there
true,
with her too. And but you are right in that. I mean, it's probably 80-20, maybe 70-30 at best. Particularly, we're talking in the 90s. I mean, when I came on the job in 93, and granted, this was a municipal police department in the Pacific Northwest, you know, Spokane, Washington. But I would say it was probably 80-20. Maybe that I'm being a little bit liberal here. It could have been tighter than that. It could have been closer to 85, male to female. For uniformed police officers, for commissioned police officers. Whereas, in the support, functions, it was probably 60-40 female, and all the different, dispatchers and records clerks and all the logistical support that goes into it, mechanics, everything, was a lot more balanced and leaned a little female. So, if you've got, a locker room is a locker room, right? I mean, when introduce a bunch of guys in one place and certain dynamics take place, and then you start changing those dynamics, and when you, mix who's in there. But yeah, she is one of the few women there, and even having a friendship with Crawford is dangerous. People are gonna, as we talked about kind of off mic, think she's trying to sleep her way to the top or whatever. But let's talk for a second about how ridiculous this premise is. As great as this movie is, this is an absolutely ridiculous premise. For Crawford, I mean, Starling is a trainee. She's not, and I don't know if it's different in the book, but in the movie, she's not even gotten through the academy yet. So she is a trainee.
Oh no, it's the same in the book too, because there's like constant talk about her having to go to the back of the line again. They use a word I can't remember right now, but you have to. The FBI is like really like sticklers about like you have to go through the entire training.
She's a washout basically, and she's going to have to go through and do we called it something different in the Army. Was now, but the point is she's a trainee. So you would never in a million years pull a trainee out to do something like this for about 100 different reasons. First off, it interrupts their training and it's detrimental to their career. Second off, they don't have the training. So unless she had an expertise that, she maybe had life experience before coming to the FBI that merited her being pulled. I mean, if Lecter was an FBI agent in training, I could see pulling him out and tapping into his life expertise, right? But Starling has none of that. And people, she has a degree in psychology. Every FBI agent has a degree in something. It's a requirement to be in the FBI. You have to be a college graduate. So there's not that. And it almost speaks a little bit to what you were talking about the fact that he has a little bit of a crush on her, for lack of a better term, because he chooses to pull her out and to give her all this responsibility and send her to talk to Lecter. I mean, this is a guy who, in the Thomas Harris universe, right, was a challenge for an experienced FBI agent and Will Graham to deal with. And you're going to send a brand new recruit who isn't even through training yet, who, doesn't have the extensive experience in life. And I mean, it's dangerous for her. It's just, I don't get it. It's the only real thing. I mean, you could talk about the ham-fisted, everybody's hitting on her type of stuff. That's just filmmaking. But from a story structure, from a storytelling standpoint, it's frankly unbelievable. I cannot suspend my disbelief that this would ever happen. I mean, there's a movie called Rush from the 90s as well, with Jason Patric and Jennifer Jason Leigh. Most people probably haven't seen it these days, but if you know the Eric Clapton song Tears in Heaven, it was written originally for this movie. But they pull a recruit out of the academy and have her go undercover as a narcotics agent. And this was in the 70s. And the reason they did it is because nobody knew her face yet. And all the druggies knew the faces of all the cops. So they needed, that made a little bit of sense. It was 20 years earlier where practices weren't as professional. And it was based on a real experience that the author who wrote the book had. So there, obviously it happened at one time, but now we're talking early 90s. We're talking about the FBI, which is button down, button up compared to any other law enforcement organization. It's just, I mean, I'll be honest with you, it's kind of stupid. I mean, it's really just not that believable at all. And it didn't bother me as much when I initially watched it or read the book, but when I rewatched it here a couple nights ago, it was, I threw up my hands at it. I was like, this is totally stupid. This would never, ever happen.
Well, this is the other side of the coin where I think a lot of people will just take away like being the female in the male world and just focus on all the negatives that come with it. I'm going to say Starling wouldn't get this job unless Crawford thought she was attractive. That's the reason why I think that's the reason why he picks her too. I think he respects her because of her intellect and her drive and her work ethic. But if this was like a female that he wasn't attracted to, she wouldn't be getting this opportunity. And I understand your perspective in the sense of, you have a background in law enforcement, how these things work. This just would not happen. But I think that's the reason why she got the job, was because Crawford finds her attractive.
Crawford knows Lecter, not as well as maybe Will Graham, did, but he does know Lecter to a degree. And so it is also possible that he picked Starling based upon his belief that Lecter would actually talk to her. So that's the only way I can see myself, it's the only path to possibility that I see here. And I don't remember how it was framed in the book. So that's on me. But if you present it to me that, yes, she is a trainee and I would never do this in a million years, except I have no one else that Lecter will talk to. And he's proven that, but I think he'll talk to her. And since she does have a degree in psychology and she's doing really well and she's a hard worker and she's smart, the risk to her is somewhat mitigated. So I'm going to go for it. That's the one sort of, okay, that there's a path to plausibility there. But boy, because it's such an implausible thing, I would like to see that explanation actually kind of played out pretty bluntly to dispel that, difficulty to suspend disbelief. But anyway, I've complained about that long enough.